All right, good afternoon. Good afternoon. All right. So this panel is obviously going to be about war stories and things that each one of the panelists have encountered in their government careers. So to give a chance to hear some interesting stories, and feel free if you've got a question after they do introductions after a particular story or whatever you want to ask more. Just go up to one of the mics here. We'll make it a little bit more informal so you have a chance to ask more questions. I know a couple panels before we really didn't have a lot of time to take questions, so I want to give everybody a chance to have more opportunity to dig into a particular area. So again, it's something I just like doing every time, is just to get a feel for the audience. How many are in government now? How many are supporting the government besides paying taxes? Okay, if you're not paying taxes, see one of these guys. They like to talk to you. Okay, so what I like to do is, first off, I'm Jerry Dixon. I ran the National Cybersecurity Division at Homeland and U.S. CERT before that, and was also at IRS for a period of time. Right now I'm with a small security group called Team Cumry. We basically focus on security research, cyber intel, that kind of thing. So Andy, you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Andrew Freed. This is like my 10th or 11th Meet the Fed at DEF CON and Black Hat. I retired 2 years ago from the Treasury Department, where I was a special agent with TIGTA. Before TIGTA was formed, we were actually part of IRS. So I have an IRS Treasury background. Everybody here has heard of the IRS, I assume? No. Fortunately, unlike Jerry, I came from a very loving environment. But because I've only been retired 2 years, I have a little bit of a problem, and that's part of the fact that I'm still within the statute of limitations of some of the things I might have done, so I probably won't say everything.
But something interesting, I just got a letter from the IRS just last week before coming out here. It's big, thick envelope, had all that. I'm like thinking, oh great, I'm going to get audited. And so, open this thing up, tear into it. 4 pages into it, realized it was a check for 89 cents that they owed me. So they sent me 4 pages and plus postage to send me 89 cents. So, they do give back at times.
Well, good afternoon. My name is John Idonisi. All of my time in the federal government has been with Special Operations Forces in the intelligence community. This is the first Black Hat I've actually been allowed to come to. I want to thank Jim Christie for having me here and inviting me year after year, and all my bosses saying no. I now work for a very interesting company, White Canvas Group, and we build creative and disruptive technologies. My intent here is just to kind of share what I can, some perspectives of what I encountered utilizing cyber capabilities in different ways and different forms. So that's sort of what I'd like to talk to you about.
My name is Kevin Manson. My most embarrassing moment took place within the last hour, so I'll brief you on that shortly. I'm a former state magistrate. I was a former prosecutor, worked in the Senate Judiciary Committee back in the early 80s. My first assignment was sitting in on, we're actually doing staff work on Sandra Day O'Connor, our first female United States Supreme Court Justice. Last 20 years or thereabout, since I retired, I was involved in training young college students who wanted to become a Secret Service agent or an ATF agent or whatnot, federal law enforcement. And it was a very great privilege to do that. I also want to thank Jim for having me here because I'm a former Fed. And us former Feds over at DEF CON, we get to have some very special flags that we're not allowed to have here. But if you're curious about that, you can come over to DEF CON and see the flags I'm talking about.
Yeah, you definitely want to come to DEF CON.
Yes.
I'm Mark Sox. I'm a retired Army officer. Did 20 years, retired back in 2001. Spent first half of the career doing civil engineering, jumping out of airplanes, blowing things up kind of stuff. And then the second half building networks and fighting this new cyber conflict world that none of us understood back in the 1990s. Following the events of September 11th, spent a year and a half at the National Security Council, working for President Bush early in his first term, and was part of the team that stood up and opened the doors at Homeland Security, created U.S. CERT and all that. Since the end of '03, I've been in the private sector. I work at Verizon. I do public policy work at the national security level in cyber, and rather than confessing, which I will do, to things that might be embarrassing to us or to our country, I'm going to be sharing some things that were embarrassing at the time, but from which we learned a lot of lessons. So these are things, luckily I've been far enough out of the government now I can talk about it, and It's not going to embarrass too many people.
Thanks, Mark. This is on here. Thanks, Mark. I'm Tom Tallur. I'm a retired NASA executive. I spent 31 years in the government. I retired at the turn of the century, so I've been retired 10 years now. My 31 years spanned 4 federal law enforcement agencies. I was a postal inspector. I was with NCIS. I was with DCIS, and I retired from NASA. I did my last 10 or so years there. My retiring expertise which I applied after I retired, I went to work as a partner for KPMG and for Marsh, and then I left the big consulting firms, and I've been working on writing a book about the future. It's supposed to be done by December, according to my publishing contract. It's a book about the far future, the exploitation of advanced technologies and what our world's going to be like in the future by 2050, 2070. It has to do with my NASA work. My background principally was in white-collar crime and a lot of things until we got to the cyber world. But for those of you with any interest, since we're out here in Nevada, I spent almost all of my career cleared to investigate wrongdoing in what they call the black world, the intelligence community. So just so that you know, there are no aliens at Area 51. We just do secret work in the government to do some cool things that we can use for military capabilities. I won't get into what I'm going to talk about. I've got some ideas, but I'd like to, I think, probably just tell all of you what kinds of things go on in the government, what kinds of things that you don't see from behind the scenes that might make it a little more illuminating for you to understand why some things don't seem to happen. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Jerry.
Okay, thanks everybody. So, one of the key things, like I said, we want to kind of touch on some war stories or again, it's a great point, things that happen behind the scenes that you might not be familiar with or exposed to. So, to kick things off, just to warn everybody, Andy's always got some great opinions and he always helps liven up the panel. So I'm anxious to hear what Andy's got to share with us.
Thanks, Jerry.
No, you got to do your first story, Jerry.
They made me put away my stash of porn. I was really going to go into that. So I don't have much left to talk about because of Jerry. Boo. No. I have been involved in the computer investigations for the full 20 years that I was at IRS. And it's been very interesting to see kind of how things have evolved. And I really realized that our laws don't work well in our favor sometimes, at least to the citizens' advantage. And I remember we had one day where we got all this spam email coming in, and we were kind of curious as to how they got this many names and addresses from a government agency. We suspected that the machine was infected, but we didn't know if the person whose computer this was that was sending them was involved in the crime. So I was kind of interested in doing 2 things. Number 1, talking to the people, but number 2, getting their system and analyzing to see if there were viruses on there and if the lists that were actually forwarded by a bot contained all the email addresses of the mail that was sent to this agency. So I remember going downtown Cheyenne, Wyoming. Anybody here ever been to Cheyenne, Wyoming? Well, I've never been in a place quite like Cheyenne, Wyoming, where we literally parked right next to the federal building. I didn't think that was possible in this day and age, but I think my car was 30 feet from the front door. I remember going up and talking to this old style magistrate, very, very nice guy. But he asked me a question after I went over the information that was contained in a search warrant that I was going to use to get this machine to examine it. And he said, so tell me, Special Agent Freed, do you believe that the people whose house you're going to search are guilty of a crime? And I told him, and I was always very honest, and I said there's about a 99% chance they're an innocent victim and that they're going to have no idea why we're showing up at their house, and that we'll hopefully find that they weren't involved, because we're going to look to prove that as much as that they are guilty. And the magistrate says, well, then why are you executing a search warrant? And I said, well, Your Honor, this is the only tool that you give us to get that kind of information. And the reality is that when you're dealing with computer crime, if you want to look at somebody's computer, very rarely are they going to say, sure, here, take it. Because they all have something on there they don't want somebody else to see. Porn, gambling stuff, pictures of their ex-wives, pictures of their girlfriends, whatever. So we found over the years that asking somebody to borrow their computer so they can analyze it is not a good strategy, that we have to walk in there and pretty heavy-handedly take the data. I had another search warrant where we did a very similar thing. This was in Chicago. And as it turns out, the house was owned by a postal worker. I only say that because it sounded pertinent at the time. We went through there, and this gentleman had like 15 kids. And it was a small house. Everywhere we went was either food, diapers, or mattresses. We finally found the computer, and I decided to take it back to the hotel and analyze it there because I didn't want to have to like carry this stuff around. And I left my business card with the wife and explained who I was and explained how they could reach me. And the next morning I get a phone call from this guy who says, "I'm the person whose house you ransacked." Well, being the federal agent, quick-witted, I responded by saying, "Well, which one?" As it turned out, he had a sense of humor, but not at that moment, if I recall correctly. But when we got to the house, we talked. He actually turned out to be an extremely nice guy. He understood what was going on. We got the computers back to them, and everybody was happy. By the way, in that case, that was a real wide eye-opener for us because when we examined that computer, we stopped counting after we found 140 viruses. And I think that happened probably 7 or 8 years ago. It really was an eye-opener to tell you how complicated working in this environment is going to be. There's another story which I can't talk about because it's not been 5 years yet. Let's go to the next and we'll just work our way around the table.
Statute's 7 years for IRS crimes. Remember that?
Thank you, attorney.
I'm not sure if my stories are as entertaining as these guys, but I'm gonna give it my best shot. I just wanna kind of back up and unravel where this all started and why I'm here. Like I said, I met Jim Christie online on a Craigslist ad. Totally joking. I met Jim in college doing some graduate work. And when I was in the military, we did a bunch of operations overseas, and I have always been a computer guy, and I've always worked on computers since I was like 7, 8 years old. I started tinkering around then, and I've always done it. And I started thinking to myself, like, why aren't we looking forensically at the bad guy's data, because it will help us. So called up Jim, him and I started exchanging notes. Next thing you know, him and I worked together, developed a curriculum. We started training our guys in law enforcement forensics. Well, I go back to my bosses and I'm like, hey, I have a course all set up. A bunch of guys that are police officers and some federal entities are gonna train us. And they're like, John, thanks, next. And I said, well, you guys don't want this? And he said, well, what's that really gonna do for us? And I said, well, it's gonna give you a perspective because really the guys, the experts of this are the people that have to abide by the rules. And those are the federal agents. It's easy to exploit data if you don't have to apply by rules that are hold up in court. I mean, you can do it however way you want, but if you have to extract data and that you have to be able to indict somebody and that has to be evidentiary, then there's steps and procedures. So we ended up going through the course, and then fast forward 6 months later, I'm back over in a place where I shouldn't, it's not the best place to hang out. And we ended up doing a raid, and we get a bunch of information. So we're looking for somebody in particular, and I started grabbing some information about this guy on a drive that I had found, and all of the stuff we learned from DC3 and et cetera started coming into play. And I was lucky enough to actually end up later on interrogating this guy. And all the different interrogation strategies, and I'm not talking about the bad ones that we don't do, but I wanted to totally take a different angle at this. So I started using the data I found on the extracted drive as a means to run like a high-level social engineering bluffing operation, and it was truly remarkable the amount of data I got out of this guy. First of all, I never ran surveillance on him, but I described his wife and his many girlfriends because all the pictures that were on the hard drive. Second of all, I had convinced him that I knew his best friend because of all the emails that I correlated from that drive and all the sites that they belonged to. And then I had convinced him during the interrogation, I talked to my watch a little bit, and I told him to go outside and look up and then come back inside. And I said, what did you just do? Why do you think I had you look up in the sky? And he said, because you had the satellites taking pictures of me. I said, exactly. Now we can continue. So this is going on for about an hour and a half, and I have the translator next to me like, Jay, are you on drugs or something? I'm like, dude, just bear with me on this. So all the stuff that we learned, from the forensic standpoint, and a notion of what I finally concluded, there is such thing as digital exhaust. We all leave it. And digital exhaust is useful in investigations